Welcome to another Apollo Papyrus episode. I am Aaron Apollo Camp. For this episode, my interview guest is a survivor of narcissistic abuse and the author of the book Gasping for Air, which started out as a hidden journal. Her name is Dana Diaz, and here's my interview with Dana. Dana Diaz, welcome to Apollo Papyrus.
Well, thank you for having me.
Feel free to introduce yourself to our listeners.
Yes, absolutely. I published a book last year called Gasping for Air, The Stranglehold of Narcissistic Abuse. Aside from that, I just live a regular life. I'm a wife, I'm a mother to a human 20-year-old and 2 cats. And I just kind of hang out at home now and write. But the really cool thing about the book that I released was that it actually came from a journal that I was keeping in my former marriage, where I was experiencing multiple abuses with my former husband, who had an alcohol problem and was also a narcissist. So there was a lot to struggle with there with my son, and trying to keep the peace for everybody and just survive even. But I have 2 more books coming out this year, the prequel and the sequel to the book that's out. So I'm really excited that it's done so well and that people want more.
What is narcissistic abuse? Are all abusers narcissists, and are all narcissists abusers? I know that's a 3-part question.
That's okay. There's a simple answer for all of them. So I'll start with narcissistic abuse is just when a narcissist abuses you. What makes it different from other abuses, though, is that narcissistic abuse is all-encompassing, meaning some people, like in my childhood, I experienced physical abuse and verbal abuse. We all know what those are. In a narcissistic situation, a narcissist will use any tactics that they feel are going to be effective to coerce you into, whatever their end goal is, which is usually exalting them in some way to fulfill their ego. But these abuses come at you constantly and regularly. So you might be physically abused, verbally abused, emotionally abused, sexually abused, financially abused, legally. I mean, the list goes on and on. They will do anything and everything to get their end goal achieved. Now, narcissists themselves, let us clarify that. And I'm glad you asked that question, because it is so frequently used, that term. And it's thrown out there in a way right now that just means basically if you don't like somebody, they're a narcissist. And that is not anything anywhere near what the word means. If we go back to the actual origin of the word, narcissist comes from the Greek god named Narcissus, who used to look in the water and admire his reflection. So the word was meant to refer to people who like the way they look. These are people on social media that we all have seen that are taking the selfies, and honestly, they really do look as good as they think they do. So you can't really hate them, and they're not bothering anyone with it. It might annoy people that they have such a high self-esteem and think so highly of themselves, but they're not harming anybody with it. Now, the narcissists that are going to abuse you, because not all of them do, these are the ones who usually have some very deep-seated insecurity, usually goes back to something in their childhood, some kind of trauma or abuse they endured themselves. And so what they're looking for, it's kind of ironic, is that they don't really think very highly of themselves at all. So they are seeking for others to reflect back to them this sense of importance and superiority, but they are using abuse to get that. So in that respect, that kind of answers all your questions. Not all narcissists are abusive. And it's not necessarily a bad thing to be a narcissist. I wish I had that kind of self-esteem, but there are narcissists, just like any other abuser, that are going to intentionally harm you, and they don't care. They have no remorse and no empathy. They are just looking for what they can get out of it.
Without spoiling too much of Gasping for Air, and you've already mentioned the book a little bit, but what is your book about?
It is about my relationship with my former husband. And the way that I wrote it, though, there's a lot of books out there about narcissism. But when I looked for more information and to basically find other stories where people shared their experiences, there were only, I mean, at least when I looked, there were maybe three or four that I could think of. And I was looking for a very long time. I think it's because no matter what kind of abuse you experience, usually there's some shame involved, and people are reluctant to expose the people that abused them, out of fear of consequence. So I sought to really delve into the emotional, a very raw emotional aspect of it. It was coming from my perspective, and every thought that I had in every one of those difficult situations, everything I was thinking, I just wanted to be able to share them, even if they weren't polite, even if they were outright wrong or not characteristic of who I am as a person. I thought it was important to just be real, because I think that's what other victims could relate to. And that was really the purpose of it, was I wanted other people to know that they're not the only ones that are going through a situation like that. But I also wanted to give the perspective of, yes, you are seeing people every day, whether they're coworkers, family, people at your church, in your community, whatever. But just because they look okay doesn't mean they are, because oftentimes victims of abuse are hiding the truth just as much as the abusers are. So I'm really proud of how it turned out. It goes from literally right when my former husband walked into my life, through our dating, all the red flags that I ignored, all the terrible things I excused and tolerated, all the way to the very end, even after the divorce, where there were two incidents of domestic violence, and what I went through in the criminal justice and court system trying to get help that I really wasn't given at all, which unfortunately is a common thing that victims go through, because of the difficulty in really proving a lot of these abuses that narcissists use.
Now, you mentioned that you started writing your book as a hidden journal while in a relationship with a narcissistic abuser. How did you keep your journal hidden for while you were still in the relationship?
Well, what happened was I actually talked about this a little bit towards the end of the book. So when I finally had the courage that I decided I'm done with this, I'm over. Um, when you're in a situation like that, you can't just walk out. You can't just decide this is over and I'm done and I'm out of here. So I consulted with an attorney. I was given some homework. I had to get some things in order before I could file for divorce. And a week later, we went into the shelter in place for COVID. So unfortunately, I was not only in an unhappy marriage, I was locked in a house with a man who had threatened my life. So I started keeping a journal. Now, mind you, this journal was actually a notebook that moms that are listening can understand this. At the end of the school year, when your kid comes home with all their notebooks and all their school supplies, there's some notebooks that they've only used some of the pages of. So I kept those because I'm a writer. I like scrap paper. I like having notebooks, but I ripped out the pages that my son had scribbled on, and I used the remaining pages to keep track of, I put the date and time. This is what was said. This is what happened, because I honestly feared for my life. And I thought keeping it in something that looked like my son's old notebook from school would be unsuspecting if it was discovered. But I had also, because I was afraid for my life, I obviously was not sleeping in the same bed with this man. So I had moved to our cold, dark basement where we had a couple of couches, and I was just using the one sofa as a bed that I slept on. And so I kept this old notebook that I was recording the incidents, all the occurrences that were happening in our house. I was keeping it under the couch cushion there, hoping that it wouldn't be found. However, if something did happen to me, the whole point was that hopefully somebody would find it and know that he was certainly the perpetrator, even if it was made to look like an accident.
Now, what process did you have to go? Did you finish writing the book after uh, the divorce, and how were you able to turn your hidden journal into a book?
Well, yeah, it was after the divorce because I mean, I don't mean to be joking, but I was busy trying to be alive and get divorced from this man. So once the shelter in place was lifted and courts reopened and everything else, we proceeded and got through all of that. So what I had done basically during COVID, during the time I was still in the house and still legally married to him, since we had time on our hands not working, I was taking some of these stories and elaborating them into my computer, just into Microsoft Word. And I think it was a lot of it was for me as well, because we hear this term gaslighting. Anytime I would confront him or, address him on something, he would say, "No, I never said that. That never happened." And I knew I wasn't delusional. So it was important for me to record my very real memories as I recalled these events, just for my own sake more than anything. But when I decided that, I think this might actually make a book, and I think this is a book that can help people, I just kind of, compiled all the stories together, and submitted the manuscript for evaluation to some different publishers. And I was really excited, that I had a couple that were interested. And, certainly they helped me develop it into what is the published product today.
Is the Gasping for Air self published, traditionally published, or published via hybrid press?
You know what? I actually decided to self-publish for numerous reasons, but I am using what's called an author service. So everything is being professionally evaluated for content. I spend most of my time in content editing, actually, just trying to determine what is relevant, making sure the story arc is correct and, structuring it properly. And then I basically sign over, to them and pay them to do the professional editing and copywriting, all the stuff. So I am doing all the writing. When the editor comes back and says, "This is all the stuff," I am the one personally going back and moving the commas and apostrophes and, the readjusting sentences and doing all that. But I wanted it to be that way because this is very personal to me. And I think that's different than if I would have written, a fictional story of some sort, because this is my memoir, basically. And so it was just really important that I retain all control over everything. But again, with the cover, the font, the layout, all the different aspects of publishing, I am working with professionals that are giving me different options, walking me through the process, but I have full control at the end, to say yay or nay to anything or adjust anything accordingly.
Now, is it correct that you're currently in the process of publishing the prequel and the sequel to Gasping for Air?
Yeah, I already had, though I'm a journaler. I unfortunately had an abusive childhood, and I've had, unfortunately, some nasty people that I've had to deal with since my divorce, that have shamed me. We hear this term victim shaming, and people that have turned on me. And I think these are also really relevant experiences that other victims of abuse can relate to. But I never intended to publish any more than the one book. But I guess I'm in a very blessed position that I have had so many fans, even though it's kind of sad to say that I have fans for a book about abuse, but I have so many people that want more. They really like my writing style and they like my directness and the truth that I speak, and they want more of it. So yeah, I'm a little motivated trying to do both at once, and it's definitely challenging. But I'm very fortunate that I've been able to kind of put the rest of my life on hold to be able to get these out. Hopefully by the end of the year, we'll see at least one, but hopefully both of them.
Now, this is going to sound like a completely stupid question to some of our listeners, but how did your education in journalism and psychology at DePaul University in Chicago help you leave your abusive relationship?
Well, it's interesting because coming from an abusive childhood, I always, and I'm talking about back to when I was 5, 6 years old, I knew that I was being mistreated. It's just unfortunate being that little, I could be as tenacious as I was and stand up for myself. It would only be met with, unpleasant consequences, but I always knew it was wrong. So by the time I was about 12 or 13 years old, I had a very strong sense about the lack of justice that I was experiencing, that I was just so um, compelled to do something to help victims of abuse in my adult life. So when I was faced with having to go to college, it's funny because I wanted to go to beauty school, but my stepfather, who honestly is also a narcissist, said that that wasn't good enough. He had raised me, and no child coming from his house was going to go to a beauty school because that wasn't real school. I had to go to university. So I was accepted into DePaul University in Chicago. I didn't really know what to do. So I actually started there in pre-law thinking I'll just become a lawyer. I will get children out of situations like the one I was in. I will help families, recover from abusive situations. But I also realized that I was naive and idealistic, because that's not the way the world works. And sometimes you have to, especially as a young new lawyer, you have to represent people who may be guilty. And I just could not. I was just, oh, seething just at the thought of it. I could not handle that possibility. But as it turned out, all of my professors and my counselors, saw that I was just very naturally talented in writing and speaking. So they kind of directed me into the journalism program there I have a degree in communications, and I minored in psychology because I still felt strongly about healing my own trauma, but also being able to help other people. So it's kind of interesting how, later in life, I never was able to use that education because when I did get married to, my former husband, the last thing he wanted was for me to have any sense of achievement or success. So he moved me 90 miles outside of the city in a podunk town. There was nowhere to work except Walmart and a gas station, but he had me cleaning houses. He had gotten me a job with his best friend's wife cleaning, old farmhouses and for people in these small towns. So it's kind of ironic that everything kind of came full circle at the end, where I was taking my journal and basically using my journalism and psychology degree to give this perspective that I offered in Gasping for Air.
What advice would you give to someone who is in an abusive relationship with a narcissist?
Well, the first thing I think people expect me to say, get out, make a plan to escape. It's unfortunate, but a very real truth that not everybody is able to escape safely, especially if there are children involved. And there's even something that I didn't have room to discuss in my very long manuscript was animals. And there's so many reasons why people can't just walk out. They're not going to leave their children and their animals and, their home and everything else. So all I tell people is, your abuser best. I am not saying to submit necessarily, but I knew what made him tick. I knew that what to say or not to say, or what to do or not to do, to keep peace. So for my sanity and for my son's well-being, I did what I had to do to keep the peace while I did make a plan to get us out of there. And it took me 15 years. I pray that not everybody has to wait that long. But the one thing that I did do that I always recommend to people, and anybody should do this anyway. I mean, God forbid any of us are in a situation where we have to grab and go, as I call it. But I went and got a very small, waterproof, fireproof safe from Walmart. It was only $50, but it has a little handle, and I was only 93 pounds and I could carry it just fine. It was a little thing, but I socked away some cash. If I had, my grandma sends me $20 for my birthday or whatever, or if there were tips or bonuses from work, I put them in there. So I had a cash stash just in case I needed it. All of my relevant documents, social security card, a copy of my driver's license, birth certificate, all of those important documents of mine and my son's were all in this little safe. So I also had a jump drive in there of any documents or, like tax returns, things like that would have been on my computer. I saved them on a jump drive, kept them in the safe. Reason being, if we had an opportunity and all I could do is grab and go, all I needed to do was grab that little safe, grab my kid, and get out of the house, because you know what? Your life cannot be replaced. You can replace clothes, you can replace a house, you can replace cars and things and whatever, but it's also best if you don't have to go back there to try to get anything that you might need to reestablish your life.
What can others do if they think someone is in an abusive relationship with a narcissist?
So here's the thing. If you're in an abusive relationship, you know it. You don't need other people telling you or acknowledging it, because then all you feel is more shame for being perceived as weak and being perceived as, unable or unwilling to leave the situation. So I love how this world has offered us this wonderful thing of podcasting, because what I like to do and what I tell everybody, send this podcast to somebody. Just, you can share it and just say, hey, this sounded really interesting. You might find it interesting to listen to, because they can listen to it in the car on the way to work or on the way to do groceries or wherever they're going. And it's not confrontational. It's kind of taking you personally out of the situation. It just gives the person some things to think about, because most of all, victims of abuse don't realize that other people are or have experienced what they have, and they don't know how to leave or where to even begin to think about the concept. So just share the information. Handing them my book is probably not going to be very effective, because, having a book that says abuse on it in their home, not a good idea. Having, expecting them to have time to read a 400-page book, probably not going to happen, but everybody has 10, 15, 30 minutes to listen to a podcast.
I'm going to ask the last couple questions I have written down as a single multi-part question. What are
Okay.
some of the mental and physical effects of narcissistic abuse, and how was the healing process after you got out of your abusive relationship like?
Okay, so mentally, I think it's pretty obvious when you're being abused. I mean, there's certainly a lot of shame involved in that. There's a lot of anxiety, because you're worried about everything you're doing. You're walking on eggshells, so to speak, hoping and praying that you're not going to provoke any more abuse. Um, you know, People struggle with depression and suicide a lot in those situations, because they don't see a way out other than, losing their life or taking their own life. So it's a very real struggle. And I know there's help for it, but it's not likely that somebody that's a victim of abuse is going to go and say, oh, bye, abuser, I'll be back in an hour. I'm going to get therapy for having to live with you. It's just not realistic. They're terrified to even expose their abuser at all. So they're not going to reach out usually and talk to anybody. But the physical part, I think, is the most unacknowledged aspect of abuse, because all of us, no matter what situation in it, I know, people might even get nervous. My son used to get stomach aches when he'd get nervous for a test at school that he wasn't quite prepared for. Anxiety can really turn your body against you, and stress. I never realized that stress could kill you until my former marriage. And as a matter of fact, it was not the abuse itself, but the physical consequences of what I was experiencing that were the motivator for me to actually end the marriage. Because by the end of my 25 years with my ex-husband, my body basically turned against me too. I had so much cortisol, which is a stress hormone, running through my body that I became autoimmune. I couldn't figure out, I had about 2 dozen completely random symptoms that were debilitating, each on, in their own way. But everything from neurological, cardiovascular, digestive, muscular, my body was in havoc. I also dropped almost 20 pounds within 2 weeks. I was a skeletal 93 pounds, and I ended up with a lung disease as well because of this stress hormone cortisol. And my lung disease, is the doctor said, is like having COPD and fibromyalgia all at once. So you can imagine what that feels like. And this is irreversible. I will live with it the rest of my life. I ended up even with a backpack oxygen machine, particularly during COVID. My oxygen has been down to 83%, where I could barely see, barely walk, barely breathe. So it is a very real thing that if anybody, for me, it started with stomach aches and migraines. But if you feel like you're having more physical symptoms, that's definitely a sign that your body is experiencing the stress of the mental part of your life, the things that you really need to change lifestyle wise. So the healing process began. I think it all begins with just being out of that situation. That there's a saying that, a flower can't grow in toxic soil, and it's kind of the same for your mind and body. You're not going to bloom in a place that made you sick. So for me, it was getting divorced, obviously, and it's sad to say, after 25 years, but completely cutting my ex-husband out of my life. And that means no contact, no texts, no emails, no talking. I could not have him influencing my mind and body anymore. But the irony of that is that it's a common thing that victims of narcissistic abuse experience, but you realize after about a month or so being away from that person and cutting contact completely, you just begin to thrive, because in that time, in that short little time, most of my physical symptoms went away. And I mean, to say I could breathe better is, symbolic and literal all at the same time. It was like an awakening, that he really was just making me sick in so many ways. So from there, obviously, I had to kind of, put life back together and resolve everything of the past. And there's so many different therapies out there right now, and not everybody can afford therapy, but even just at home, which is where I had to start, and journaling is always what I turn to, but everybody's different. But it's just a matter of just getting in touch with how you feel, accepting how you feel. Don't be ashamed for it. Try to understand your situation. But where the real understanding and the healing lies is to get that the shame that you're carrying and the trauma that you endured was a result of your abuser's unhealed trauma. they have issues that they are not willing to take accountability for and that they have not healed themselves. And that's why they shamed you and burdened you with it. And I think once you realize that, you can come to a certain peace and be able to move forward in your life in a much better place.
That is scary, listening to the physical effects of being abused. My mother is on a home oxygen supply because she was a smoker for over 50 years until she quit smoking about 2 years ago. And your body was so affected by being abused by a narcissist that you had to go on an oxygen supply. That is
Yes, and I've
scary to
never
think
smoked.
about.
Yeah, I've never smoked a cigarette or anything in my life. It is scary, but that's why I think people don't realize the real physical effect. And I have met so many people since my book has come out that have expressed to me that they also are autoimmune because of, trauma that they've endured. And they are also, fibromyalgia is a big one, and lung issues are a big one. So it's something that can definitely, so I always say they can take your life without putting their hands on you. And your life is worth more than that. You don't want to let that happen.
Dana Diaz, thank you for appearing on Apollo Papyrus. You were a wonderful and insightful guest.
Oh, thank you so much. And thank you so much for having me. I appreciate the opportunity.
It is a major problem in society that far too many people are abused by narcissists, and I thank Dana for shining a light on a difficult but important subject to talk about. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding y'all to write and read your passion. Bye for now. Remember to subscribe to the Apollo Papyrus YouTube channel at www.youtube.com/@Apollo Papyrus and the Apollo Papyrus Substack newsletter at apollopapyrus.substack.com. Y'all can visit the Apollo Papyrus website at campaaronapollo.witsite.com/Apollo Papyrus and follow Apollo Papyrus on Threads, Instagram, Facebook, and Tumblr at Apollo Papyrus. Copyright 2024, Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of our audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited, except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.